started to have a dream of writing fishing articles and books when I was 8 years old. And I submitted a couple of very bad articles to Field and Stream, and the editor there at the time was very kind, sent me back my articles with a nice letter of encouragement. So I always had this on my mind to do. And of course I was very busy with school from my teenage years right through my 20s. And when I came out of graduate school and with the PhD with the idea of going back to college teaching, I had, for the first time in my life, I had the credentials to write about science, and I had a little bit more time to pursue that interest. And I had to think about what are my goals in writing fishing articles and books. What do I want to accomplish? And I think I really want to accomplish three things. First, I want to improve the skills of anglers. And the second thing is that I want to encourage them to be good sportsmen and stewards of the sport. And the third thing is to develop a sense of love and respect of the sport itself, not only the creatures that we pursue, but the sport itself. And I thought if I could tell people some of the things that I do that work for me, and some of the mistakes that I've made that I've eliminated from what I do, that it would help people become interested in connecting to the sport of surf fishing, to connecting to nature, and therefore become better stewards and become better anglers, and also at the same time develop a love of the sport. What I've noticed in the history of the 20th century with respect to wildlife and fishing and sports like that is that the more deeply somebody is immersed, the more likely they are going to be an advocate for conservation. And so these three things have always been on my mind as I have written my books and my articles. The essence of my approach to surf fishing is dominated by three factors: bait, structure, and presentation. And then as I apply these three pieces, I analyze. I'm always analyzing what's going on within each element. So what kind of bait do I have? How do I go about identifying it? Where is it? How much bait of that type is there? How are the fish likely to feed on that bait? In terms of structure, what kind of structure do I have? Is it accessible? How do I need to approach that structure with my lures? And then presentations, very much neglected aspect of fishing in general, and especially surf fishing. Presentations. How do I present the lure? When, where, how, what speed, what depth? So I try to analyze with respect to the depth of the water, the type of bait, the type of structure. I try to analyze how best to present my lure. And I may have to experiment a little bit because the fish may not be on the precise piece of the structure they were yesterday, or they traditionally. I may have to move it off a little bit. I may have to change what I call the angle of the dangle, which a 2, 3, 4, 5 degree change in the angle of your cast can make all the difference in terms of how the lure sweeps in front of the structure, in terms of how the lure sweeps in front of the fish, and how they respond to it. Bucktails have become a significant, if not the most significant, tool in my fishing lure arsenal. And I get a lot of questions about it because I wrote a book on bucktails. And so I naturally get a lot of questions about it at seminars and even on the beach. Bucktails are important to me and are an essential lure for me because I can imitate any kind of bait. I can catch any kind of game fish under any kind of circumstances. I can fish them at any level in the water column. I can make them move in different ways. In other words, it's a very versatile lure. Most of the other lures we use, if you stop to think about it, are really limited. They're what I call niche lures. So you can only use a pencil popper on the surface. You can only use a popper on the surface. You can only use a tin really properly near the bottom. And you can only really retrieve them at one speed. If you retrieve them too quickly, they tend to spin. They don't get that back and forth wiggle. Perhaps the biggest niche lure of all is metal lip swimming plugs, because you have to have just the right surface conditions, you have to have just the right kind of bait, you have to have just the right separation in the bait, just the right separation in the game fish. The game fish have to be hunting out individuals. So that's probably the classic example of a niche lure. Whereas with bucktails, feeding on sand eels, no problem. Feeding on peanut bunker, no problem. Feeding on adult bunker, no problem. Feeding on herring, no problems. Feeding on spearing, no problems. Whatever they're feeding on, I can duplicate that with a bucktail. It amazes me how many people have problems with the bucktail. They think it's complicated. Actually, it's the simplest lure to use, because at its very basic use, you throw it out and you reel it back at a moderate speed. And so there is nothing mystical about it. It is not difficult to use, and yet I'm mystified by how many people have problems with it. And I think it goes back to, it doesn't wiggle, it doesn't pop, it doesn't appear to do anything. But actually, when used with the proper pork rind, and you were to view it under the surface, you would see that the hairs breathe, that is, they plump out and come down together in a compressed form, and the pork rind just kind of wiggles along. And so that is the action of the bucktail, and you don't need any dramatic action. So that's the motion. And I think that because it doesn't appear to wiggle a lot and pop and squirm and other things like that, people don't use it enough. They'll make a few casts. I'll ask them, did you try the bucktail? Oh yeah. How many casts? 3 or 4. No. If you want to get comfortable with a bucktail, you have to cast it all day long and experiment with it, slower, faster. What kind of bait? Back to the original idea of what's my approach to surf fishing? Well, in relation to the bait, in relation to the structure, in relation to that gives you the presentation. So its versatility, its ability to imitate almost any bait that swims, that really is at the heart of why I use a bucktail. Question's been posed to me, what I think is the biggest hindrance to new surf fishermen becoming more successful at what they do. And I think there's 2 main reasons. One is they are generally underpowered. This madness to be lighter, lightest has a place. But when I think of myself fishing in the surf under the conditions I like the best, which would be waves over 5 feet, wind in my face at 20 miles an hour, raining, cloudy, big currents, big fish, big baits. How do I do that with light gear? How do I cast a big lure? How do I sink a hook? How do I fight a fish under those conditions? So I think being underpowered is a big hindrance to developing your skills, because now you have to come up with a whole host of reasons why you got a hit and didn't sink the hook, why you dropped the fish halfway in, why you can't use the lure that you need to reach the fish, why my line broke, which really isn't, it was the knot that broke 99% of the time. So that's a big problem. The other problem is, in this age of instant gratification, people don't seem to want to work at learning how to do something. They want now. Show me how I go, where do I go, what do I use, because I want to catch a 50 now. Well, I've got a few 50s under my belt, and I can tell you I never went out and said, Tonight, I'm catching a 50. But when you learn fish behavior, and you learn bait behavior, and you understand structure, and you have the right tackle, you can actually go to big fish spots. That is, places where big fish tend to hang out. Well, there's a little bit of a problem with that, because you go to a big fish spot and you fish it, you have to fish it every night, generally, for a tide sequence. There's not a lot of fish. You know, it's not a school of 550 bass like you might have with 3-pound schoolies. So you're gonna cast and cast and cast and cast, and if you get one hit a night, you better be ready. Now, how do you do all of that if you don't perfect your skills? If you don't work hard at learning about the basics? If you don't learn how to focus? If you don't learn how to analyze? If all you want to do is catch a big fish? That's why I guess so many people choose to hire a guide, because then it's on the guide, and I did that too. And I had customers who wanted to learn, and I loved them. And I had customers that could care less, and all they wanted me to do is put them into a fish. So you can be any kind of fisherman you want, it's free country, but if you really want to get better, if you really want to be a top-notch surf fisherman, you have to work at it. As many people know who read my articles and books, I'm a staunch advocate for catch and release. And from time to time, people will come up to me at a show and question that. Why, how, and why did I get that point of view? I think it starts with my father. My father was, in many ways, a man way ahead of his time. And he started taking me fishing in the 1940s when I was a real little kid. And although catch and release was virtually unheard of in those days, he would say to me when I caught a fish, throw that one back, it's too little. We'll catch him next time, he'll be bigger. Now, of course, as a little kid, I wanted to take a whole pile of fish home and show them to Mom and brag, you know, and have Mom say, oh, wonderful, what a big boy you are. But he was wise, and he never let me do that. And as a result, over time, I started to realize that what was I going to do with all those fish anyway? And as I grew older and became an independent fisherman and started to read news articles and see things on television about overfishing, I realized that he was right. And I became more and more involved, and I met people like Fred Schwab and Bob Branch, and who were staunch advocates of catch and release of striped bass. So a philosophy emerged. I think that I'm concerned over the years, or become more and more concerned over the years, that the economics of fisheries has become more important than the fish themselves. And that as long as there's a big price tag on these fish, there's a lot of pressure to harvest more and more of them. And I'm not so sure that the criteria that are used by fisheries managers to determine how many fish can be managed is accurate. For example, let's take the story of the salmon. If we go back to the 1950s, Jacques Cousteau went to Alaska to do a story on salmon and to study the salmon. And in the process of doing so, he reported in the television show how important he discovered it was that these salmon die, because as they die and decay, they put their nutrients back into the ecosystem, which supports a vast food chain that allows more of the salmon to survive. And if we move it up a little bit into the 1980s and 90s, we find out that pressure to harvest the salmon has become so intense that they put strong limits on, in some places, on the time they can harvest the salmon and how they have to do it. And it's a frenzy of 24 hours in some of these places. Boats almost bumping into each other and so on. So how many fish should be let go? How many salmon should be allowed to migrate upstream and spawn and then die? And just recently, in the last 10 years or so, they found out that Cousteau was right, and that they're not letting enough salmon die. And that's one of the reasons why the year classes haven't been as good as they should be. So I think it's a cautionary tale that we should all realize that although there's nothing wrong with keeping a fish here and there to enjoy, that keeping as many or killing as many as is possible is not the best approach. And I think that with so many more people on the planet and the demand for our marine resources increasing all the time, we have to be more cautious than ever. And we have to, if we're going to make a mistake, we have to err on the side of conservation and preservation, not on the side of the dollar bill, which is where I think it is right now. I think the most significant aspect of surf fishing that I find to be missing today cannot really be understood unless we go back to the post-World War II period, because that was the era of tremendous explosion of interest in surf fishing. If we do that, we find out that the modern sport of surf fishing was basically created by a small group of returning veterans who found that when they returned, they had more leisure time in their jobs than they previously did, because this was also the era of social change where people not everybody worked 6 days and not everybody worked 12 hours. And so all of a sudden we found that people had longer vacations and they had weekends off and they had time to pursue their interests. And one of those for many people was surf fishing. Those early surf fishermen, and I was trained by some of them, valued respect for the sport. The sport first, the fish first actually, the sport second, and themselves third. When you do that, I think etiquette on the beach improves drastically. I think wanton killing of fish kind of subsides to a more reasonable level. I think it's easier to organize people together to fight for the sport, to fight for access, to fight for the fisheries, to fight for the habitats. Those people, I got a very real sense in listening to those people and being with those people that they were together. They believed in the same things. It wasn't all about them as individuals. Today, the sense I get is that me, 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 me. Get out of my way, who are you? I'll do what I want. I'm not interested in joining an organization. I don't want to fight for it. If there's no more fish anymore, I'll go play golf. That kind of attitude, I think, bothers me a great deal, and it did not exist when I started into this heavy in the 1950s. The current state of striped bass fishery is very clear. The agency that manages striped bass is the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. And by their own reports, the female spawning biomass is down 26%. By their own assessment, the Chesapeake in the last 10 years has only had 2 good year classes. That's 2003 and 4. And those have been most of the fish that we've been enjoying in the coastal migration. In the Hudson, which is the next biggest contributor to the East Coast population, we've only had 1, and that's 2007, and it was supposed to be very large. Now, I've been fishing for stripers in the Hudson River all my life, pretty much. And I can tell you, whenever we have a year class as big as the 2007 was supposed to be, or anything close to it, they were like cockroaches. Every place you went to fish, you couldn't get away from them. And in this particular case, I can't find them. And nobody I talk to finds them. And there is no cockroach effect. So I'm wondering if either the sampling that created the index number was somehow flawed, or that those fish perhaps didn't find the right food or conditions in their first year and died, because they are not there in the numbers that we are told they should be. So I think that we are doing, once again, what we did in the 1980s, and we are taking too many fish because it isn't being supported by really good year classes. The pressure to take even more fish is growing because of the dollar value in the fish. And therefore, under this pressure, the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission delayed action on reducing the mortality. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that people don't realize how many average citizens are involved in the striped bass fishery in a reasonable and measured way. I think they tend to see the big effects only on the economy and don't realize that every time somebody drives to Montauk and stays in a motel at Montauk and stops in at a tackle shop and buys lures and lines, hires a guide who makes their living off of the striped bass, I think that the managers don't understand that dollar value. And that dollar value doesn't have to include killing. So I think that the state of the fishery is on the decline. I think it's a serious issue. I think it needs to be addressed. I think that I don't have a lot of confidence in the ability, not necessarily the intent or desire, but the ability given economic and social pressures. I don't have a lot of confidence that the managers will be able to do what they would like to do or what needs to be done. So I spend a lot of my time praying for big year classes, one after the other, to make up for the human mistakes and the human greed